Good morning, and thank you for attending this panel. This is a presentation about a steel box, namely the T-series of U.S. Navy landing pontoons, which would serve in amphibious operations in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. It is a talk about a historiographical gap in the literature of Operation Overlord and its naval component, Operation Neptune. Lastly, this is a story about a forgotten Anglo-American relationship between an inventor and an innovator, who together birthed structures which further the logistical buildup of personnel, supplies, and vehicles critical to the success of Overlord. The brainchild behind the Navy landing pontoon was John Noble Laycock, a 1914 Naval Academy graduate. He transferred to the Civil Engineer Corps in 1915 and graduated with his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 1917. That same June, he formally transferred from the line to the Civil Engineer Corps. And after a variety of assignments in the Western Hemisphere, in mid-March of 1939, Laycock accepted an offer from Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, Chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, or BUDOCS, to transfer to Washington, D.C. to become the War Plans Officer tasked with reviewing and preparing all of the Bureau's sections of the Navy's various war plans. Foremost among these was War Plan Orange, conceived in the event of war between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The geographic scale of the Pacific proved the most troublesome for planners and strategists, who recognized the need to seize and develop advanced bases to resupply and repair the fleet and secure logistical and communication lines. In the early 1930s, the Naval War Plans Division in turn reached out to BUDOCS to leverage its intellectual resources for the development of advanced fixed and mobile bases. Now, BUDOC's War Plans section confronted an array of unresolved questions ranging from personnel to technologies to solve the primary issue, building a naval base in a remote, undeveloped location. As early as 1932, the Bureau began contemplating the use of standardized pontoon units for the advanced bases. In 1936, Lieutenant Commander Paul W. Haynes of the Construction Corps noticed a sectional steel pontoon barge for gold dredge under construction at the Union Iron Works in San Francisco. He provided BUDOCS with details and a drawing of how he believed the box sections could be connected to form a barge. Now, Laycock first examined Haynes's sketch in summer of 1939, but he found faults with the proposal. And around July 1940, he built a model for experimentation from empty cigar boxes and wood model kite sticks. This simple model demonstrated the feasibility of connecting individual pontoons using continuous angles to create a well-diaphragmed sectional box girder. After a contracted company failed to produce plans for the matter of fastening and assembling the pontoons, Laycock opted to use his family vacation to solve the problem himself, which he did by essentially scaling up his model and constructing it from steel. 7 criteria would factor into the final dimensions of the pontoon, which can be seen here on the slide before you. In October of 1940, through trial and error, Laycock determined the ideal pontoon dimensions would produce a box measuring 5 by 7 by 5 feet. With all of the designs complete by December of 1940, BUDOCS entered a contract with the Pittsburgh Des Moines Steel Company on February 18, 1941, to fabricate pontoon units for testing and evaluation. 2 pontoon designs were constructed, the 5 by 7 by 5 foot T6 box and the 5 by 7 by 7 T7, which had a curved section at one end for use as a prow on barges. After its withdrawal from Western Europe in June 1940, the British Chiefs of Staff stood up what became known as Combined Operations Headquarters. This new joint air-sea land organization would plan, train, and direct offensive operations against enemy-occupied territories. Within Combined Operations was the Development Center, tasked with examining and experimenting with craft and equipment for combined operations. And by summer of 1941, its commandant, Captain Thomas Andrew Hussey, received instructions to investigate problems likely to be encountered with large-scale amphibious operations in Europe, particularly in the landing of vehicles and supplies. And foremost among these problems was bridging the gap from ship to shore. Now, from November to December of 1941, Hussey led an Admiralty delegation to Washington to share and discuss designs for the LSD, LCT, and most importantly, the LST. And in the week prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hussey visited Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, where he first learned of BUDOCS's new pontoons. Impressed with the equipment and its potential for amphibious operations, Hussey reported the technology to Combined Operations leadership upon his return to England in January of 42. The British saw utility for the pontoons in certain circumstances, primarily in the construction of jetties for small landing vessels in the absence of port facilities, but they took no further action. After the successful Allied landings in North Africa, Operation Torch, in November of 42, Hussey, who was now Director of Experiments and Staff Requirements, learned of planning for the next operation, the invasion of Sicily, codenamed Husky. Hussey's examination of sounding charts of the island, however, revealed gently sloping seafloors for all the planned invasion beaches, which would cause LSTs to ground out 500 feet from the shoreline in water 6 feet deep. Waterproofed vehicles could only safely wade ashore from no farther than 300 feet from the beach. Alarmed, Hussey brought the issue before the Chief of Combined Operations, Vice Admiral Louis Mountbatten, who recommended that the captain assemble a team of technical experts to find a solution. But following discussion in mid-December, the only known option involved use of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Treadway Bridge, which had seen use in the torch landings. The structure, however, had also proven unstable at moving tanks from ship to shore, required over an hour to assemble in calm seas, and had to be stowed on the tank deck of an LST, using up valuable space on even more valuable ships. Hussey chewed over the problem until he came upon a novel solution. On February 21st, 1943, he presented Mountbatten with the idea of a floating prefabricated roadway causeway using the American naval pontoons. These, he explained, could be towed behind the LSTs to the beaches until positioned so that forward momentum would drive the causeways ashore. And once in place, they could be secured to the LST ramp so vehicles could drive right off the ship and up onto the beach. Mountbatten liked Hussey's proposal and immediately ordered the captain to Washington to press for construction of a prototype as well as operational trials. Yet upon his arrival in Washington on March 4th, Hussey found no effort underway for conducting trials. Undaunted, he connected with Laycock and explained his idea for a massive 350-foot-long pontoon barge to bridge the ship-to-shore gap. Yet time and existing pontoon material made this barge impractical. So instead, Laycock designed a 175-foot-long causeway composed of 2 pontoons wide by 30 pontoons in length. By using 2 of these structures overlapped in a manner akin to a slide rule, a maximum length of 325 feet could be safely constructed to bridge the gap. On March 18th, Hussey's trial commenced in Narragansett Bay. The first LST approached the shore carrying 2 M7 105mm self-propelled howitzers and towing alongside 2 175-foot pontoon causeway sections connected end to end. Prior to the LST grounding, the causeway was slipped and forward momentum drove it up on the beach. Within 8 minutes, the Seabees maneuvered the causeway into alignment with the LST bow ramp, flooded the individual pontoons, and anchored the causeway on the seafloor. The first M7 idled on the beach 16.5 minutes after the LST grounded. For the next trial, an LCT came ashore and grounded. A crew from the Army Corps of Engineers then began to unload and assemble a treadway bridge until 360 feet of it linked the LST to shore. And after 45 minutes, the 2 M7s from the first test drove over the treadway bridge and into the LST. Now, the demonstration convinced senior planners that amphibious landings could work with either system, but the naval landing pontoons proved the superior design for the task at hand. And the following day, the Navy Department agreed to supply all the necessary pontoon equipment for the invasion. And thus, in the early morning hours of July 10, 1943, Husky commenced. 10 LSTs side-carried causeways, while 6 more causeways were towed to the assault beaches for the United States 7th Army's landing along the Gulf of Gala. All arrived without incident, and despite 5-foot seas which compounded problems aligning the causeways with the LSTs, as well as the nuisancing attacks by the Luftwaffe, the pontoons worked brilliantly. In 23 days of round-the-clock shifts, over 10,000 vehicles came ashore via the causeways. When British General Sir Bernard Montgomery stepped from his landing craft onto a causeway, Mountbatten remarked, quote, "The general is not setting foot on Sicily. He is setting foot on one of these miraculous American pontoons." The following month, at the Inter-Allied Conference in Quebec, leaders approved an outline plan for a cross-channel invasion for the coast of Normandy, France, codenamed Overlord, with its naval component codenamed Neptune. Getting ashore and staying ashore required a massive buildup of supplies, vehicles, and men. Recognizing the need for port facilities, but also the challenge of seizing the nearby port at Cherbourg, British planners hatched on the scheme of building artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry, able to discharge approximately 6,000 tons daily. 2 of these harbors, Mulberry A, off the American beach Omaha near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, and Mulberry B, off the British Gold Beach near Armagh, were planned to provide sheltered water by D+4 and be fully established by D+14. But as with Sicily, coastal geography complicated landing supplies on the beaches. The Bay of the Seine featured flat sandy beaches with near flat slopes and a tidal range of 21 feet with a high water duration of 3 hours. At low tide with water at a depth of 12 to 18 feet, a ship would thus find itself grounded out over half a mile from shore. Now, LSTs seemed the logical choice to land supplies, but the Normandy tidal range, coupled with long flat beaches, risked valuable ships being stranded for hours, thereby becoming a new type of LST, the large stationary target, vulnerable to artillery or air attack. Even before the landings at Sicily, Hussey happened upon another solution to bridging the gap, this in the form of a large self-propelled shallow draft raft with ramps at both ends able to ferry and discharge the entire deck load of an LST in one trip. Laycock converted Hussey's idea to reality by merging three pontoon causeways to create a 60 by 30 pontoon barge measuring 175 feet long by 42 feet wide. The barge could move 300 tons of cargo, carry 30 to 40 vehicles, and was large enough to unload an entire LST in only 2 trips. Tests in Rhode Island in August of 1943 of a prototype barge demonstrated its feasibility, albeit in need of some refinement. An experienced barge crew required about 15 minutes to moor the barge to the bow ramp of an LST in the open sea, but 10 32-ton medium tanks and 2 11-ton half-tracks could be loaded in less than 5 minutes and ferried 3/4 of a mile in an equal amount of time. It was during these tests of the prototype that a naval aviator flew overhead and spied this strange barge with a pontoon protrusion on its stern and a narrow ramp end on the bow. And bemused, the aviator referred to the contraption as resembling a rhinoceros, and thus the Rhino ferry was christened. Now, efforts to refine the Rhino design would occur in England from December of 43 to January of 44. There, further tests and operations with the early Rhinos resulted in changes, which can be seen here on the slide. Notably, the larger 60-ton ramp, visible in the lower left, was replaced with the wood Olson ramp and 2 inverted scow pontoons seen in the upper right. 2 outboard engines were also fitted to the outermost stern pontoons to propel and drive the barge, along with plastic armor around both engines to protect the mechanism and the operator from bomb or shell splinters. Crews for the American Rhino ferries came from among the 28th, 81st, and 111th Naval Construction Battalions. The British Rhinos would be manned by British Army personnel from the 935th, 940th, 961st, and 966 Inland Water Transport Companies. The American recruits received only a few days training with the Rhinos, while the British actually received considerable periods of training as well as participation in exercises with British and Canadian assault forces. And as work progressed on assembling the Rhinos, engineers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force requested installation of pontoon causeways on the invasion beaches for ship-to-shore offloading until the mulberries were operational. These causeways would be sunk in place, extending from the high water line to just beyond the line of minimum low water. Each of the American invasion beaches would have 2 of these causeways installed to serve smaller vessels, predominantly the LCT, and the British planned to assemble 2 causeways each for Gold and Juno beaches and 1 at Sword. To support the LCT and smaller craft unloading, engineers mounted 4x12 pontoon blisters to the causeway, spaced intermittently from 250 to 350 feet apart along both sides. This arrangement ensured that 1 blister would always be available for unloading LCTs regardless of tidal conditions. The Seabees would assemble and man the American causeways, while engineers from 15 GHQ Troops engineers would man, construct, and maintain the British causeways. On D-Day, June 6th, LSTs towed Rhino ferries to all 5 invasion beaches. The American tows went well without issue, but the Royal Navy lost 3 Rhinos, 1 from each of their invasion forces, as well as 17 Rhino tugs crossing the English Channel. Heavy seas complicated the marriage process between LSTs and barge at every beach. But by that afternoon, all 5 had Rhinos come ashore, although weather conditions and issues of beach organization reduced the activities. On June 7th, with the beaches now secure, the surviving Allied Rhino force commenced 24-hour operations to meet pressing supply demands. The American Rhino forces at Utah and Omaha reached full capacity and worked throughout the day landing and discharging cargoes of varying mass. 1 Rhino, which you can see here, came ashore at Omaha Beach with a load of 12 combat-loaded M4 Sherman tanks. This is over 400 tons, leaving a freeboard of mere inches. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, the British found themselves confronting 100 LSTs still unloaded by D+1, with operational Rhinos barely at 50%. And despite dedicated efforts, the Rhino force failed to meet Overlord's initial supply objectives. Omaha remained in shambles after the initial landings, with a total of only 4,581 tons of supplies landed by D+3, rather than the planned 8,000 tons daily. By June 7th, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, Naval Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, authorized the beaching of LSTs at all but Omaha. The failure of the British Rhino force to unload the LSTs at Gold, Juno, and Sword played a significant role in this decision. But with the risk of enemy artillery still in play at Omaha, the Rhino ferries and smaller craft would have to carry the bulk of material ashore until June 10th, when Ramsay authorized the LSTs to beach themselves. Thereafter, all the Rhino ferries would serve as lighters for Liberty ships, where they proved ideal for the task within the sheltered waters of the mulberries. The pontoon causeways would all arrive in pieces off the 5 invasion beaches throughout June 7th. At Omaha, Seabees completed installation of Easterly Causeway number 1 on June 11th. Beach examinations there revealed a shorter length would be sufficient, so the Seabees doubled the causeway width, and the final assembly measured 28 feet by 1,456 feet, which you can see here. Westerly Causeway number 2 came online on June 16th at Omaha. At Utah Beach, a Seabee detachment managed to install most of Easterly Causeway number 1 on June 8th and completed it the following day, measuring 14 feet wide by 2,200 feet long. Utah's Westerly Causeway number 2 was operational by June 15th. And from June 6th to the 13th, 85% of all vehicles and cargo came ashore at Utah, either on Rhino ferries or on pontoon causeways. For the British, assembly of the causeways commenced on D+1 and would continue up to D+29. Now, during the cross-channel tows, 10 of the 2x30 causeway sections, 6 blisters, and 1 tug were completely lost. 7 causeways, later reduced to 6, were all concurrently constructed, and their locations can be seen here on the map. But I should note that these locations would shift around as the British changed their beach procedures. Causeway number 2 on Gold Beach was the first constructed, completed on D+10, and measured 1,233 feet in length. Causeway number 1 on Gold was finished in D+16 at 1,407 feet in length. Causeway number 3 at Gold measured 2,817 feet when it was completed on July 5th, with causeways 5, 6, and 7 on Juneau all measuring over 2,000 feet or greater, completed on 8, 11, and 28 July, respectively. Causeway number 4 was the lone causeway on Sword, later dismantled when the decision was made to land all personnel and vehicles on only Juneau. As such, Causeway number 7 was comprised of the remains of causeways 2, 3, and 4. Also, unlike the American causeways, the British staggered their causeways, particularly 1 and 6, to avoid bad patches of beach. And as the causeways came into operation, British and American crews also were working to assemble the 2 mulberry harbors. Mulberry A would win the race and unload its first LST on June 16th. By June 19th, via Mulberry A, together with the Rhinos, causeways, and the beaching of vehicles, the U.S. Navy could report landing 124,404 long tons of supplies, 45,586 vehicles, and 332,269 personnel at Omaha and Utah. Mulberry B would not achieve its target figure for unloading 6,000 tons of supplies daily until July 9th, D+33. By June 19th, the British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juneau, and Sword had landed 101,184 tons of supplies, 40,272 vehicles, and 160,189 personnel. I should note of this, Mulberry B reported landing a scant 11,200 tons of stores and 1,600 personnel. Now, evaluating the Rhino ferries and the pontoon causeways and their value in Operation Neptune is quite difficult to tease out from the surviving statistical data. The Rhino ferries at the 2 American beaches from June 6th through October 21st collectively transported 91,495 vehicles and 422,195 tons of bulk cargo, with a peak daily average between the invasion period of 2,382 vehicles and 8,084 tons of cargo. And I should note this exceeds the specifications for the mulberries. Specific figures on the British Rhino ferries are unknown, but from June 11th to July 29th, the British causeways collectively transported 13,947 vehicles and 115,000 personnel ashore. For this critical period of June 8th through the 16th, the Rhinos at Omaha and Utah together delivered 19,056 vehicles, as well as 66% of the bulk cargo at Omaha, 86% of the bulk cargo at Utah. In his after-action report, Admiral Ramsey deemed the Rhino performance disappointing in the open waters of the English Channel, but he believed with greater experience and modification, the ferries might prove an effective ship-to-shore ferrying method. Colonel Eugene M. Caffey, commanding the U.S. Army's 1st Engineer Special Brigade, concluded that the pontoon causeways, quote, essentially doubled the vehicle landing capabilities of LCTs and the Rhinos, and thus contributed materially to the success of the operation. Training was cited as a limiting factor for both pontoon structures. The British Rhino and Causeway forces, quite frankly, statistically underperformed compared to the American equivalents, and the root causes were seen in the use of Army rather than Navy personnel, as well as limited experience with the equipment overall. But shortcomings aside, the pontoon structures provided Allied forces with a valuable resource in the logistical buildup vital for Overlord's success. The development of the pontoon causeway, and in turn the Rhino ferry, might never have occurred as an amphibious asset for the United States Navy had necessity not inspired the Causeway in Hussey's mind. But Hussey's ideas were for naught without Laycock's ability to develop pontoon structures capable of meeting or exceeding operational needs. Their Anglo-American working relationship made the naval landing pontoon an unsung hero in the Overlord buildup, and thereafter an essential element of practically every Allied amphibious operation for the remainder of World War II. I thank you all for your time and attention, and I'll be happy to take any and all of your questions at the conclusion of my fellow panelists. Thank you.